Hi, everybody. This is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It is Tuesday, April 10th, and I'm sitting down right now to record a special video blog talking about the Sun-Pluto Square that we have coming through in the next, approximately the next day or so. And also, we're going to take a little time to talk about how to deal with the seasonal symbolism in astrology. So those are our two topics for today. The first topic is obvious. We have a significant Sun-Pluto square because we also have Venus moving between Saturn and Mars right now. So that's a significant pair of transits to be looking at as we're also heading toward a new moon. So we'll take a look at that first. Then we're going to talk about seasonal symbolism in astrology. I get a lot of questions from people asking me, what do you do if, you're born with the sun in Aries, but, you're from Australia or someplace in the southern hemisphere, and when you were born, it was not springtime, it was autumn, Or what do we do when we say Capricorn ruled by Saturn and Saturn is the lord of winter? What do we do about that when, for some people in the world, Capricorn's taking place around the summer solstice for them, right, in the southern hemisphere? So we're going to talk a little bit about how to deal with that. What do astrologers have to say about that today? And astrologers say different things, so I'll try to represent a variety of things that we astrologers say about that, and I'll give you my own take on it as well. Okay, so excuse me, let me flip open my transits here. So in the next 24 hours, the sun in Aries is going to square Pluto in Capricorn. So let's talk a little bit about that transit. First of all, what does the sun represent? The sun is related to all things that are paternal and masculine and sort of traditionally related to the father, to men, kings, rulers, that kind of patriarchal framework where there's a male leader or head of family or head of state or something like that. But it's also not just about men or father figures or the paternal. It's also about leaders in executive or high-ranking positions of regardless of male or female. So it's just leadership in general. It's also about visibility. It's also about the sun is visible. It makes everything visible. So when we talk about the sun as a symbol, we sometimes talk about things that become visible. We also talk about the sun in relationship to illumination. Sometimes things become visible to us in a way that's not literally visible, but internally visible. So we come to a realization about something. We come to understand something. So wisdom, knowledge, clarity, the light of the mind. Ancient astrologers called the sun the organ of perception, the organ of the perception of the soul. So kind of a tongue twister. It's the means by which the soul comes to see and understand. So it's related to consciousness. The sun is also, if you take a moment, this is kind of a fun exercise. A lot of ancient people had this view. Different mystics, especially in India, one of the common views was that your consciousness is free, has free will, and it chooses on a level of conscious awareness what it wants to direct its attention to, what it desires, or maybe what it's afraid of. And as it does so, then the body, the physical body, will conform with the desires or fears that the consciousness, that the agency of the soul has, and will act and perform. However, many people believe that the actual performance of action, like, for example, let's say I decide that I'm going to make a demonstration while I'm talking in a video blog that I'm recording, and I'm going to reach my hand toward the camera, right? That exists in a place that is intentional before it's actualized, before it's performed physically. And one of the things that certain metaphysical schools would say was that the demigods, the modes of nature, and other forces that are not really the soul control the results of this. That this is not actually me doing this, that I'm a conscious soul in here intending something, but that the actual forces of nature are filled with all different kinds of beings that actually perform the actions. And that's a really trippy thing to think about. But you can take it back and make it really simple and say like this: how many times have you ever how many times have you ever been in the middle of doing something on some level rather automatically, only to realize that you aren't really present for what you're doing? Like, let's say you're reading a book and you're just flipping the page after page after page, and all of a sudden you go, I've been doing something sort of mechanically, like who's been doing that, right? Sort of like you're on autopilot. And then boom, a light of awareness comes into your mind and you realize, oh, well, actually, I've been thinking about or preoccupied with something else, and mechanically I've been doing X, Y, or Z. So similarly, when we're working with the sun, one of the fundamental things to remember when we talk about light and clarity and illumination and knowledge is that often the things we're doing in the world, you know, are being actualized by forces that we're not really in control of. And that it leads back to not fully understanding what we're doing with our free will, what we're actually intending on a level of consciousness. So under any kind of sun transit, one of the beautiful things that can happen is you can become aware of the difference between what you're doing and what you're intending, right? Or in other words, you can become aware of what you're intending and how your actions are conforming to what you're intending, and it's something you weren't actually aware of. So that's a really beautiful thing, and one of the ways that that's conceptualized by both modern depth psychologists and ancient mystics is that you become aware of the forces that have had you in their grip. You become aware of the different gods that have you on the puppet strings. And with that awareness comes the ability to come back into yourself and say, okay, I need to be more conscious about what I'm doing. So that's one way of thinking about a Sun-Pluto transit, especially because Pluto is often a planet that represents the deeper, more hidden and kind of buried forces that are working on us that we are not always aware of. So it can be, a Sun-Pluto transit can be quite explosive in the sense of revealing to us the darker or more unseen or hidden forces that have been informing our actions. So we're doing stuff, and or we do something and it comes erupting out of a place that we weren't consciously aware of, or like really we weren't in the driver's seat in some way. So Sun-Pluto can be really good for kind of like, okay, I need to wake up. I need to come back into the present and use my freedom more effectively, because the less aware that I am, the more that all these forces start pulling the puppet strings and I'm just asleep. So to really use our freedom, we have to be sort of awake to the fact that we are free. It means sometimes coming out of the grips of things that have us. And that's a big part of what the Sun and Pluto square can generate. So the Sun-Pluto is also about the death and rebirth, or the sort of transfiguration of father figures, male figures, people in leadership. And so you can see people who are in powerful positions getting taken to task, you know, or that whole phrase, speaking truth to power, or also the abuse of power, and authority, the topics of the power of abuse and authority, and how they can suddenly become very prominent. It's not out of nowhere, right? That's kind of what I was joking about in my written horoscope today, is that, oh, it's so funny. Here's the Sun-Pluto square, and what do you know? The president's lawyers' documents are being seized by the FBI. Trump's lawyer was, basically the FBI raided the lawyer's office or home or something. So that's a perfect example of a Sun-Pluto square, because here you have the head of state, Sun, and you have the plutonic forces that are revealing the things that have been happening behind the scenes. So you're becoming consciously aware of how the puppet strings have been manipulated. That's a gross, mundane example, something happening in the world around us that is expressive of the Sun-Pluto square right now. But it's happening in our own lives as well. Disenchantment with authority, calling an authority figure out for something, et cetera, all a part of Sun-Pluto squares. You get in a fight with your boss, you confrontation with your boss, you can act bossy, you can be that domineering figure a little too easily right now. You can also overly react to feeling slighted. The sun also is related not just to the sense of having a soul with free agency and trying to become aware of the fact that you have agency versus being manipulated by these different forces. But the sun is also related to this sense of the temporary sense of self that's connected to this body in this lifetime, the ego. And the ego is not just, my personality. It's your physical body. It's your heredity. It's your, it's a complex, temporary organism that's very subtle and can be very gross. But the ego, that sense of self that's unique to this lifetime, that sense of self can also get offended very easily under a Sun-Pluto transit, because the sun as ego under a Pluto transit might be feeling threatened. So the death of the ego, the death of some aspect of who we are or what we identify with, or something that we hold very near and dear to us. One of the things that there's a book that I read years ago that was really, really good. It was called The Undefended Self. And it was really driving home the point that sort of paradoxically, because we do have to take care of ourselves in the world, we are not meant to be people's doormats. We should not tolerate being victimized by other people, etc. We should stand up for one another. So there's that Sun-Pluto element of speaking truth to power. But there's also a very important thing, which is that the more that we do the spiritual work of identifying with the soul, unborn and undying, eternal, that's our true nature, the more that we do the work of cultivating soulfulness in our life, the less that the ego has to defend. And there's, again, this kind of undefended self is not the same as being a doormat or letting people beat you up or not having boundaries, or, it's not that. It's something that has a lot more to do with not necessarily, even though you're a person, realizing that the person you are can't be hurt or harmed. And so there's a kind of impenetrability and endless depth and beauty and perfection to who we each are. And tapping into that can help us when we're in situations where we feel that our legitimacy or our power or our ego is being threatened. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't circumstances where you don't have to fight, but you get what I'm saying, that Sun-Pluto is also triggery for the ego. It's also easy to fall into the illusion that this is all I am. I'm my status, I'm my wealth, I'm my position, I am having my own way, I'm needing a specific result, I have expectations. And when they're challenged, in some ways, the sign of an unhealthy ego is the one that tends to react really vindictively and viciously and really gets hyper defensive and bent out of shape, because the ego is convinced that these things amount to my safety, they amount to my sanctity, they amount to my dignity. So we go out of our way to get into power struggles and contentions and conflicts when we feel that some essential part of me is being challenged. Now, again, there's no need to let somebody, punch you in the face to make this point, right? It's not like you have to be a doormat. But it's a very good time to also allow the ego to die. Remember that the ego is a living organism. Your ego is like an ecology, an ecosystem. In an ecosystem, if you're tending to a garden, right, certain things come up and certain things wither away. And it's dynamic. It's happening like that all over the place. So similarly, our egos, we can maintain from the perspective of the soul a sense of unity in ourselves at all times, even while we allow certain elements of our ego to be challenged, to die, to let the elements of life sort of, take them down. So it's okay. It's okay to suffer a little bit of humiliation or defeat from time to time. It's okay to be sad or to just have rough moments, and to we don't always have to struggle to defend. That's one of the main things. In this sort of postmodern world that we live in, I've heard a lot of people talk about this in different ways lately. People say, this postmodern world that we live in is all about what kind of group you think you belong to, what kind of subculture or, musical subculture you belong to, or whatever. And you stake your identity on being a part of that group. And then it's all about competing group identities. And so it's sort of like a really complex, multidimensional tribalism or nationalism, right? It's like the nationalism of being like a traditional Hellenistic astrologer versus someone who's doing like modern depth psychology. Like there's all sorts of tribalisms in astrology, right? And then it goes on and on and on. What particular interest groups are you part of? Are you voting red or blue? Are you, it goes on and on like that. And a lot of people have said, this is taking away from the sort of dignity of we're individuals as well. And that's a really good point, right? This is so the Sun Pluto can be about needing to return also to individuality. There's sometimes in Sun Pluto transits where whatever groups you're part of, whatever subculture you're a part of, suddenly you're called to stand out. Suddenly you're called to be or do or say or speak something different. And that can disrupt the sense that everybody in that group has of being, sort of homogenous and being like together on something. So Sun Pluto can be very good also for having the courage to stand out and not be so identified within the cloisters of various subcultures. It's like going back to the garden analogy. If your ego is like a big garden, then sometimes we think that our ego is just one little corner of the garden, and we get really obsessed with just that's me, that's me, that's me, and we lose track of the fact that our ego is actually this ongoing developmental process, and we forget that eventually it will die and things like that. And sometimes the Sun Pluto is sort of like, okay, I remember there's actually a whole garden, and maybe I want to go over here and express myself and my individuality through a different aspect of who I am. And Sun Pluto can help you remember and sort of bring up from the depths some missing part of yourself, or some part that's been neglected or relegated to the depths, oftentimes in order to fit in somewhere else. But as long as the ego is playing these games of having to protect and defend itself, it will tend to glom on to something either very personal, that's just me, and then defend it, or it'll get involved in a group or a subculture or something, and like, this is me, and it goes like that. And so the call to come back to a sense of being a soul, we're all souls, but also being your individual soul is important right now. So also paradoxes can happen where you really love or identify with a group, with your company, with your family, etc. And then that thing that you think is holding it all together at the center, just like the sun at the center of the solar system is sort of holding everything together. Well, suns die, even stars die. And when they go, everything else goes, right? So the thing that holds it all together, that's our sense of ego, even though it's a moving target, that thing holding the family together, holding the group together, holding the experience together, can also go through a disintegration, a burnout, a death. And there's pain that comes with that because, oh, my father disappointed me, or, oh, my boss is leaving, who's going to hold the team together? Or, gosh, I was so a part of this movement, but then it just turns out that the leader or this person or that person is, human. Oh my God, you know what I mean? And then we lose all faith, or we're devastated or whatever. But it's very important to remember that to the extent that we invest our sense of self in these temporary things, which is natural, it's part of life. But to the extent that we do that and don't take time to remember the eternal being that we are, then these things are experienced as tremendously grievous, terrifying, deep, unsettling, disturbing experiences. Even though we should know that they are natural, even though if we pay attention to nature, we should know that they are natural. So this comes back to another thing. Sun Pluto can also be about the wound and aiming our attention at woundedness. And we have to be very careful of that as well, because one teacher that I really love, and someone that I have a lot of respect for from the Bhakti tradition that I've been studying, made the point that there is no utopia in the material world, because its nature is flux and change and impermanence, and death is a part of it. And so the more that we focus on the fact that things aren't staying perfect forever here in the material world, the more we become like flies who are looking to land on open sores, right? That's kind of what flies do. That's part of their nature. That's a part of nature. Sometimes that's what happens. But he suggested that for the sake of our spiritual lives and spiritual health, so that we don't get toppled over completely when people or things around us are falling apart or dying, the center can't hold anymore, the leader is falling down, etc. The image that we had of America is deteriorating. It's the Kali Yuga. Mankind is falling. The globe is on fire. All of this stuff, it makes us feel like the center is going away. And he said, so we can be like flies and focus on that. And then everything is very impersonal, because everything is about what's lacking. And what's lacking takes us away from compassion. Compassion requires that we see what's there and that we feel between each other what's there. And he said, the contrast is the bees look for nectar. They seek out sweet things. They seek out the nectar. And that's a way of saying we have to remember that our experiences are personal, that our interactions in the world are always personal. It's very hard to do that when we are identifying ourselves with structures, substructures, superstructures in the world that are destined to fall apart, because that's what we all do. That's what everything does in nature. It changes. So at any rate, important lessons for Sun Pluto. So just things to think about. Now, the other thing that you can think about right now with Sun Pluto is, it's springtime, and you have this explosion of spring-like energy. So we have birth and youthfulness and all of these sort of explosive, life-oriented qualities. So it's also a great time for spring cleaning, for purging, for starting something fresh, for tapping back into your enthusiasm or inspiration, because the sun is a source of life. Not only does it represent the center, but it also represents the seed that creates a new form. And so it's, remember, the sun in astrology is a circle with a dot in the middle. So not only is it the center, but it's also the sort of the symbolic idea of origination. So the sun is exalted in the sign of Aries for this reason. And it's a moment in the year, zodiacally speaking, when we can access regenerative qualities, and the Plutonic forces take us deep, and they clean and they purge and they purify, and they bring things up and out. For example, Sun Square Pluto, I spent 6 hours yesterday purging and cleaning the basement. It's like the most Plutonian part of the house, right? That maybe the plumbing, I don't know, but the basement. And I was down there, and it was just heavy. But this morning it was all done, and I was taking things out to the curb for donation pickup. And it's bright, it's sunny out, and I go down into the basement, and I'm like, so much now here, and here feels lighter, because you get in there and you do that work. And that's also Sun Pluto. So that's a bunch of stuff to think about for Sun Pluto right now. Now, what I want to do from here is shift into a little talk about seasonal symbolism. Some people have the question, what do we do about seasonal symbolism in astrology? I've just talked about zodiacal spring, but hey, guess what? For people in Australia, it's like autumn right now, right? It's just about autumn time. So what does that mean and how do you deal with that? Okay, so I'm going to give you a very brief rundown of this. Some people have much more, lengthier and much more eloquent ways of talking about this subject. I'm going to give you my quick breakdown. Remember that there is both a literal and symbolic level at which astrology can be understood. For example, you can talk about the moon in astrology as a symbol related to all different kinds of things like mothers. And then there's a literal sense in which a woman's menstrual cycle is connected to the moon, right? We've seen that over time, that women for thousands of years from all over the world have associated the literal cycling of the feminine reproductive system with the moon. Okay, so there's connections like that between astronomy and physical things, and they're real, and that's a part of astrology. We also know I don't remember where I read this, it was like a year ago, that some scientists were actually taking seriously the idea that the seasons of the year could have an influence on your birth. Seemed like common sense. Like, I can't believe no one's ever thought of taking that seriously before other than us astrologers. Is that real? But anyway, so someone was taking this seriously and I got pretty excited about it because I do believe that there are literal correlations between the elements of nature and including the planets and like our lives and how we are influenced, right? Okay, so you can have both a symbolic level and a literal level. So just keep that in mind, that you don't need to have one versus the other. Okay, now, second point is that astrology as a divinatory system is like the tarot. It's a set of symbols, and the symbols have seasonal correlations to them in astrology, but they do in tarot too, right? Like the sun card. If you were to cast a spread for a child in, let's say, the dead of winter, and they're born and you cast the tarot spread, a circular wheel, and let's say you put out, I don't know, 12 cards or something, and you say, okay, I want to know, I want to know something about the personality. I want to know something about, the inborn gifts that they have. You have different cards representing different kinds of things. And you flip open the first card representing their personality, and you get the sun card in tarot, which is like the ultimate springy, summery card. It's not the literal card, right? It's not that the tarot card is what is making them spring and summer-like in personality, right? It's a symbol, so it has symbolic reflection of the innate qualities of the person. You can have really sunny disposition being born in the middle of winter, right? So first of all, going back just a step though, first of all, you don't have to take the seasonal symbolic symbolism of astrology literally. In other words, if you're born in Aries, it doesn't mean that literally the rays and qualities and influences of the spring element when you were born were influencing you. For example, maybe you live in Southern California, right? It's not like there's a huge contrast in all of the year as there is if you live in Minnesota, right? But nobody really complains about that in the Northern Hemisphere. Nobody really has a problem with that level of seasonal fluctuation or variation anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. It tends to come up when you say, what about people in the Southern Hemisphere? Okay, so at any rate, first big point is, just like a tarot card doesn't literally cause the thing to be what it is, it has a symbolic correlation, so too should the language of astrology be understood as, at least on one level, symbolic. Okay, so then you also have to remember that this symbolic language of astrology, because it comes through the planets and because it comes through the signs and because it comes through the heavens, it is oriented in terms of a certain place on Earth. The zodiac is in the tropical zodiac of the Western astrology. The zodiac is oriented according to the seasons. And it's oriented according to the seasons as seen and experienced in the sky from the northern hemisphere. The whole system is defined by that. Okay, so in fact, well, okay, I'll just save that for later. So when you enter into the symbolic system of astrology, you are entering into a symbolic system that is oriented from a physical location on Earth toward the heavens. But that does not mean that it is not still symbolic in nature. So in other words, you could be born an Aries in Australia. It doesn't mean that you will be autumnal and Libra-like because you're born in Aries and it's Libra. It's the same time of year as Libra season in Southern Hemisphere, right? No, I don't think personally that that's the way to read it. And this is just my opinion. I'll give you some other ideas too. Instead, the way that you understand it is, if I want to participate in the symbolic language of astrology, then I participate from the orientation of its perspective. And its perspective, archetypally, symbolically, not just literally, is that if you're born between this month and this month, that is zodiacal spring. And so I'm, zodiacally speaking, I'm an Aries, which is correlated to the archetypal meaning of spring. Okay, so that's, it doesn't discount the fact that we're not trying to say you were really born in spring even though you were born in autumn. No, we're saying you were born in zodiacal spring. Within the orientation and symbolic language of astrology, you were born in zodiacal spring. And that archetypally has an influence on you. Now, the next thing to say is that a lot of people fret over this because they're saying it's a lot of it has to do with sun sign astrology. Like, well, if I'm a Taurus and that's middle of spring, and I'm actually in Australia, then I'm born in the middle of Scorpio season, so that shouldn't I be more like a Scorpio? Well, the problem with that reasoning also is that ancient astrologers, and classically for thousands of years, astrologers would never talk about your personality, character, profile in terms of just the sun. So you'd have a wide variety of ways of talking about analyzing or assessing or delineating what a person is like that is far more sophisticated than just their sun sign. To calculate temperament, for example, you look at the element that's rising, you look at the sign of the ruling planet of the rising, you look at the phase of the moon, you look at the season of the year, you look at aspects being made to the moon and ascendant from planets and the signs that they're in elementally, and you calculate it to say whether someone is more fiery, earthy, airy, or watery, or choleric, sanguine, melancholic, or phlegmatic. In other words, the way that astrologers have typically had of understanding something like a personality profile is far more sophisticated than just the symbolism of the sun, which means that we also have to be careful because most of the rest of the planets, though they are traveling through signs that have seasonal associations with them, are the ones speaking to who we are, right? So like, for example, Venus is, let's say Saturn is Saturn's in Leo or something, right? Saturn's in Leo. That may have a really defining role to play in the delineation of your character. Let's say you're born with Saturn right on the ascendant in Leo. Well, that's going to be a description of who you are. But it could be the middle of Capricorn season. Do you know what I mean? So if you're in the middle of Capricorn season from a solar perspective, yet you're still going to demonstrate the Saturn and Leo combination, that's exactly the point, that none of this is literally tethered to the seasons. Because how else could it be that you could express a combination of a wintry Saturn with the fixed solar quality of summer? And that's a difficult combination anyway. It's challenging. Sometimes you see kind of rigid, wintry authority figure types, people that are supposed to be bright and magnanimous, but sometimes they're a little controlling and kind of heavy and conservative. You get that juxtaposition of qualities is symbolic. It has nothing to do with the person being born in winter or summer. It's a combination of the two, archetypally speaking. So again, one of the other problems that people tend to run into when getting stuck in this northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere thing is the fact that we're talking about archetypal and symbolic language, not just literal. Though I, again, would have everyone remember that there is a level at which, the season in which you're born, the celestial, natural influences are a part of life. But I don't think that we have to try to shoehorn the language of astrology into accommodating for the flipped hemisphere. Personally, I don't think it's a fruitful activity or necessary one, though there are some people who spend their time literally trying to flip the zodiac so that it's like everything is opposite in the southern hemisphere and so forth. Because I see it as a symbolic language, I don't see that as necessary. Excuse me. So also, if you really want to understand the symbolism of the planets within the system that we have, then you have to just try to understand the orientation that they come from with the sky. And remember that it's not to be taken, at least at the top level, it's not to be taken literally. Okay. Here's a simple analogy. Easter is celebrated all over the world. It's a spring holiday that represents rebirth in the Christian tradition, celebrated all over the world despite the hemispheric differences. Similarly, we can celebrate the symbolic value of Christmas when you're in Hawaii. You know what I mean? So this is, that doesn't mean that there isn't valuable import to the return of light in the winter and the depth and darkness of snow and coldness and ice, and then the slow returning of the light, the melting of the snow in spring. All of that stuff is valuable, but we have to remember that within the human imagination and the human psyche, those are perennial experiences, and there's no place on planet Earth that could perfectly orient the sky in a way to reflect those seasonal elements for everybody. So you either use one for everybody and remember that it's symbolic, or you try to flip them and accommodate for both. I'm open to either. I'm not going to be dogmatic about it, but I do think that it's a sort of exercise in futility to try and flip the zodiac, rather than just learning the symbolic language of one and applying it like any other esoteric art form to a soul that's beyond time and space limitations anyway. So at any rate, that's what I have for today. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope that you have a very beautiful rest of your day and not too intense Sun-Pluto square. Let's see if there's any questions now. Let's see. Good morning. Yes, good morning to you. Ashley, yes, this Cancer has been dealing with a lot of this, especially with the Pisces in her life. Okay. Lisa says, being falsely accused really activates this. Misrepresented but can't defend because to do so would ultimately not be in the best interest of someone you love. There's strength and purity that comes from that type of fire. Thank you. Natal Pluto is square my natal sun and ascendant. Oh, yeah, that's a big transit. Catherine says, that's so funny. This morning, for the first time since I moved in, I was like, I have to clean my basement. Yeah, it's a good time to do it. It'll feel good. Might be a little treacherous. You might discover some buried treasures or some what do you call it? Some forgotten objects or something. Any last questions, anyone? Otherwise, I'm going to sign off. Okay. You guys remember my next class is coming up on Sundays starting June 10th. I will be holding class from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern time for another year-long program. The class is called Ancient Astrology for Modern Times. We look at ancient astrological techniques. In the first 6 months, we study theory, really learning what ancient astrologers were doing, how does it contrast to what we do in modern astrology. And then we look at the second 6 months, we really spend a lot of time working with live clients so that you can think about how this stuff is applied and how you might apply it yourself. Have need-based tuition, an early bird rate that if you're hurting like single parent, or you're in school, or you are in some kind of financial crisis and you really want to attend class, we have options for you. Otherwise, early bird rate until the program starts in June, and then a payment plan for people who need to pay monthly as they go. So we also have a spring speaker series coming up. Let me tell you about that really quick. We have 3 guest speakers coming. The first one is next Wednesday night, April 18th. Henry Seltzer from Astrograph, if you know time passages, he's the guy behind all that. He's giving a talk called Dwarfs, Gods, and Goddesses, the Impact of Newly Discovered Planets. Really excited for that. Tuesday, April 24th, Nick Dagan Best will be giving a talk called What's Up, Uranus? Uranus and Taurus edition. We'll be talking about the entry of Uranus into Taurus next month. And then Shireen Vismaya will be with us on April 30th, presenting a talk on Venus retrogrades. All of those talks are free and by donation, so if you're interested in joining, you can check those out. All right, take care, everyone. Have a good one. Bye.